he asked the question, who do you think creates the money in the economy? And I'm pretty sure it went something like 80% thought the government created money, 15% thought that the central bank creates money, and about 5% thought that regular retail banks create money. Why a wealth tax wouldn't work? Well, the wealthy have their money in these trust funds already. They've had them there for however long they've had their money for, in the form of trusts, in the form of corporations that have the trusts there, where the value of the gardens around the Tokyo Palace, the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, which are actually smaller than Central Park, so you have a reference. The gardens around, this is how powerful the tool was and altogether the Japanese economic growth was. The gardens around the palace in the Imperial Palace in Tokyo were worth more than California. All of California. Which today is sort of 1.5 times the value of the British economy, California. The economics in practice, the real economics, not behavioural or game economics or game theory, is a keystone over an archway, and all of the other topics, departments, every other subject leans off of economics. You can't have medicine, you can't have law, you can't have politics, you can't have accounting, you can't have engineering without successful economics, because you can't have them all without a successful economy. And that's why it's so important to understand all these, and that's why it's so important to have high growth and low inflation. And that's meant that in 1960 the average price of a house was £2,000. £2,000 adjusted for inflation from 1960 is £115,000 today, and the average house price today is about £350,000, and that's 3 times 115,000. So house prices have trebled in relation to inflation from 1960. Hello and welcome to another talk about economics. Today we'll be talking about why and how Britain's economy has failed over the last 70 years in comparison to its OECD competitors, especially the East Asian economies. But the focus will be on Britain itself. I might directly compare it to the economic policies of specifically South Korea and Japan, but the focus will be on Britain, specifically because of the contemporary British economists that focus on Britain. My writing, my reading, my specialism has been on these East Asian economies that have grown so well, and since World War II eaten Britain's lunch. In terms, for example, of South Korea, whose was for many years after World War II the world's largest shipbuilding nation, whereas it's immediately after the war years and during, Britain had the largest shipbuilding industry in the world. To begin there, then, the common status quo is that South Korea was able to build ships so efficiently because it had a large, cheap workforce. Well, the population is 51 million, which is smaller than the UK's or equivalent to. That's a good comparison. And today the GDP per capita is $45,000 as compared to $38,000 in the UK. So the mainstream theory just doesn't fly. It has flown. Referring to Japan, which was the immediate comparator between, from the UK in the post-war years, Western economists repeatedly referred to Japan's success as the Japanese economic miracle in many examples. It was the mainstream thought was they work hard. Just it's a hard not to see it as a racist excuse for the Japanese growth, which didn't bear up with any analysis of their industry, of their workers. I mean, on the surface level, their unions rejected daylight saving hours when it was introduced, despite them being on the same line of latitude as the UK, because it was some Western idea to make them work harder and work more hours, which was unacceptable to them. This idea that the Japanese and South Koreans just like to work harder, work longer, for their money is ridiculous. It's always been the case that they've had more successful, better monetary policies, better economic policies that have led to their major companies growing so hard, so fast, and to why Britain has Nissan and Honda plants in the UK, whereas immediately after World War II, the UK was the largest car exporter in the world. But the question is why Britain's economy has done so badly. Well, if you just exclude the British Empire and actually look at the history of Britain in the 20th century and our economics versus our engineering successes, none of it begins to make sense whatsoever if you think of how well our economics has done. If you go in reverse chronological order, we invented CT scanners. Barclays in the 70s rolled out the first ATM machine. Skipped 1969, Concorde. A man in his shed invented hovercraft in the 60s. World's first computer, Tommy Flowers in World War II. First radar, Frank Whittle invented the jet engine. Alexander Fleming and antibiotics. Ernest Rutherford split the atom. And there's a few I've missed. So technologically, television, for instance, John Baird, Britain's been top of the pile, and of all of those technological achievements, there's not been the top of the world for any of them. Computers, television, radar. So why has that been if we had good economics? Then money would have gone into industry. But before I talk about what I spend a lot of time and have done in the past reading about, which is monetary policy, and monetary policy which we don't study and economists don't on the face of it understand. I mean, if they did, then it's not in the mainstream public knowledge, that's for sure. When we talk about monetary policy in the press, it's interest rates, and everything else is fiscal policy, which is taxation. So this is all takes a long time to explain. My last video is a reaction video, and my last videos before that were from 2018. So I'm responding, I suppose, in this one to the reaction video, which came across as perhaps very harsh to viewers, and I got some great comments on that, honestly. And Britain has and has in my lifetime a resort to fiscal policy, high taxation, and taxations have gone up and up to the highest they've been in ever. That's definitely 70 years, and they take the form of predominantly stealth taxes. Stealth taxes came in the Thatcher years hugely because both parties couldn't be seen to be putting up taxes, so the stealth taxes were introduced. Now we've got to the point where we have such high taxes that it's very hard for people to get deposits up to raise a mortgage, pay for mortgage. But it's still called for by the Labour Party and the Conservative Party to have a wealth tax. And people will, I'm always going to say wealth tax is a great idea. But in the 1960s, Britain made, that the same arguments were called for, and the powers that be made sure that this would be a moot point. And Britain, more than any country in the world, made sure that wealth taxes would be null and void. There'd be no point in having a wealth tax in the 60s. And why? And well, this is a very, very important point to know. And I'm going to link to a fantastic article on this point. Well, what's Britain's second largest financial centre? If included in Britain, it's part of British state, as they see it. It's also Europe's second biggest financial centre. So it's kind of a trick question. It's bigger than Zurich and Frankfurt and Barcelona, which are seen as Europe's second biggest financial centres after London. Trick question because it's got a population of 60,000 and it's not in Europe. It's Georgetown, capital of Cayman Islands, and it's second only to London, and it's far bigger than Manchester or Birmingham. It has trillions of assets, and it is a offshore tax haven. And the majority of the monies there are trusts. Trusts are a unique type of security, and they are there so that people's monies are hidden securely, and so that it can't be seen whose monies are in trust. I mean, the layman does know a lot about how offshore tax havens work, but Britain was the curator of these specific offshore tax havens in the 60s. There have been numerous documentaries and interviews done with the leaders, the presidents, the prime minister, powers that be who run these offshore tax havens. The Cayman Islands feels perhaps close to the USA, but it is a UK administered island. I forget the specific term, but offshore territory. And they very much feel that we were created by the UK and administered by the UK. And there's a lot of the kind of Spider-Man meme of pointing fingers at each other in terms of who controls who. And they feel that it's up to the UK government if they need to have these tax havens that they are running be looked into further, have more checks and balances put in place, etc., etc. Why a wealth tax wouldn't work? Well, the wealthy have their money in these trust funds already. They've had them there for however long they've had their money for, in the form of trusts, in the form of corporations that have the trusts there. So the first point I'd like to knock on the head is that it's very in vogue right now to have a wealth tax. The first video I acted to was of Gary Stevenson going on about a wealth tax and why it's not a vote winner. Well, he should know when he talks about, I'm not wealthy, who's really wealthy, guys who have hundreds of million. They have their money, and they've always had their money offshore, in these islands set up by the British government in the 60s. And Jersey, Isle of Man, Gibraltar are all part of it. They have their tax havens as well, and they're all part of a chain that leads to usually the Cayman Islands or the British Virgin Islands, which is the second biggest. I'm not actually a sort of expert on that, but it's very interesting. Well, I probably wouldn't say I'm an expert on a lot of this, but I read and write a lot about it. But that's been a big part of the UK's decline. It's been one big factor, and that's the deregulation of the financial sector by the UK government. So the second point is that the government this Conservative government talks about how fiscal policy is the answer. Rishi Sunak's talked about that a lot, and he's increased taxes. And the last government, the Conservative and Lib Dem coalition, they increased taxes. The Labour government increased taxes beforehand. So no government in my lifetime has really done a lot to reduce taxes, but still we think that increasing taxes is the answer. So, and that leads to the enlargement of the state. So one of the best books on economics is definitely this book. I mean, I could explain myself, but just this Economics in One Lesson, Henry Hazlitt, sums up why taxation is not. That's definitely one of the best books of all time. Sums up why taxation is never the answer to a growing economy, and fiscal policy is all about taxation. But to summarise why is that this, I suppose, to keep it simple as possible, is when you're taking them, it is rather obvious, but when you're taking the money off of people and taking it to the state, less money in the economy for people to perform transactions with, which will grow the economy, of course, creating jobs in the government. And there are models, the best analogy of how money works in an economy in the state is this model I found. Explains it best of a bath. I might link to a video. You can also say it's maybe like a lake. The bath, you see, has taps and a plug. And economy has taps and a plug as well, because banks create money, and the plug at the bottom is the ability to destroy money in the form of debt. Interesting segue here is that my professor, who's one of the greatest economists alive today for certain, Professor Richard Werner, conducted the first empirical study of what people actually thought in relation to the money supply, and I'll link that below. But I've not looked up all these figures for a while, but he conducted it in Germany, and he asked the question, who do you think creates the money in the economy? And I'm pretty sure it went something like 80% thought the government created money, 15% thought that the central bank creates money, and about 5% thought that regular retail banks create money. And banks create money, 100%. Well, not 100% of money, but M0, M1, M2, M3 is banks, and M4 is the central bank. And those are money aggregates. Now, monetary economists use aggregates, and they've been proven right. It's the correct way of measuring credit. And but basically, it's always been shown that banks create money, and the central bank of the UK, of England, the Bank of England, has at 3 different points said that it subscribes to the 3 theories of how of money is created, which is the credit creation theory, financial intermediation theory, and the fractional reserve theory. So it can't make its mind up on the 3 theories of how money is created, but banks certainly do create the money in our system. And talking about how banks create money is interesting, but again, it's up back to the point of how Britain's economy has done so bad in the last 70 years. But politicians only want to talk about tax. What I mentioned in the last video is how we have the most deregulated mortgage sector in the world. What I've written about and doesn't. I mean, my professor, the professor I had at university, is an absolutely top professor. His book outsold Harry Potter in Japan, where he first published it. He was an advisor to the Bank of Japan. I have it here. I didn't get it signed or anything, but I got it from him for free. So if you had to read 2 books on economics, this would probably be number 1. It's about Japanese central banks on the surface, but it provides one of the best historical overviews of, and this would be number 2 probably. Well, there's a very good 1 and 2 to start with, but there's a lot of others. This provides such a great overview of the history of economics from the beginning of money creation in wax tablets in Mesopotamia and onwards. You learn so much from one chapter of that book, and unusually for an academic economics book, it's been in such high demand. It's on a second edition at the moment. And that's the first edition, and that's not common, but it's such a great book and in such demand. And if you Google Professor Richard Werner, some of his clips are just fantastic. His teachings and he talks about monetary policy in Japan and how they grew so fast, how they overtook Britain, how they became the world's second economy. So from 1951 to 1989, they were the world's second largest economy by nominal GDP, which is a bit of a it's a bit of a trick question. If you were to ask what's the world's second largest economy from the 50s to the 80s, because you can't count the Soviet Union, who had a population of 300 million. Japan's population 125 million, because you couldn't really calculate the Soviet Union by GDP in nominal terms, but by export market, of course you could count Japan, and they were by far the world's second biggest economy. But how do they do it following the post-World War II years? Well, that's so fascinating. And the mainstream theory is it was an economic miracle. They just worked extremely hard, and we can't really explain it, and no one particularly tried. The one that the main economist that did try was Joseph Stiglitz in the 80s. And I think he wrote one book and then sort of gave up, and then everyone else put it down to the Japanese economic miracle. But really fascinatingly, I could talk about it a while. They would show up to the GATT, which is the Global Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is the precursor of the WTO, every year in the 70s and 60s, each year when they were at the top of the table, second to the Americans. And each year at the GATT, the delegation from each country states what your next year's inflation and what your next year's GDP is going to be. And of course, just like today, you get out David Cameron, Foreign Secretary, or Rishi Sunak, or whoever you like, and you ask them what's your next year's GDP or inflation going to be. And just like for the last 70 years, Chancellor Zecher or whoever, you ask them, and of course they're going to get it wrong by a country mile, because what certainty do they have about the forecasts for the UK's economy? And it was the same with every other country. But the Japanese showed up to the GATT, and every year throughout the 60s and 70s, except for towards the end of the 70s, they would tell you that next year their economy was going to grow by 6.6%, and inflation would be about 3.2%, for instance. Next year, the data would come out, and that year it would be 6.6% growth and 3.2% whatever inflation, absolutely on the nose. Of course, I think it was about in the 70s, and you read about it in Professor Werner's book. They sort of were thinking, shit, this is not good, and we need to start, getting the numbers wrong. So they did. They started getting the numbers wrong because they were clearly bending the rules somehow. No one quite knew how, and so the numbers, they started to fudge. So to get it wrong, just like every other country there. But yes, understanding how they did do it right, how they control their economy, it's very interesting. Firstly, it was worth noting that they did have a democracy, and South Korea has democracy, but for the 40 years they were very high growth. They had the same party, and Professor Verne makes it very clear. I've not gone to Japan and I've not made a study of it myself, so I've done other things, but it makes it very clear that the politicians were seen as a bit of a hindrance to the growth of the economy. So we need to have the same politicians for 40 years, and so then we can just concentrate on economics, please. So the same party 40 years, and can you please just administer our economic policies, from the Bank of Japan and also the Ministry of Finance, and that's a very interesting interplay between the MOF and the BOJ in the Bank of Japan. And the key monetary policy tool is called window guidance, as outlined in that book. And this is the absolute key to their growth. And I'll come back to the British failings. It's kind of like I've read far more about what China and Japan did right, kind of like what makes teams win rather than what's made Britain lose. But I have read a lot about what's made Britain lose too, which is understandable. I'll get back to a bit of Japan, but Britain was the world's first economy, the greatest economy for so much time, and that lingers today, absolutely. You read Lord Mervyn King's memoirs, and I will go back to Japan thing, but it's called The End of Alchemy and something. And at the beginning of the book, it said I was inspired to write this book by a meeting I had with a senior member of a PBOC official, and he stated that you've learnt a lot in Britain from Adam Smith and whatever. I'll try and get the exact quote, but you still have a lot to learn between the relationship between banking and money. And he took that as a personal affront. And he thought it was a real big dig. After they played tennis on the lawn and they'd had salmon and champagne, which he states, and he took that as a personal affront, and then he writes his entire memoirs books about coming up with an entirely new monetary policy from scratch. Calls it the Pawnbroker Four Seasons, and he doesn't spend a minute researching about Chinese monetary policy and how China's completely outstripped the rest of the world. The PBOC head of the PBOC in 2011 when they met, does them this massive favour and said Britain's not yet quite figured out the relationship between banking and money, which spoiler is absolutely bang on. China has, quite clearly. We all hate the Chinese because they've done so well, but yeah, their economics is really bloody good, and their economic policy, we get it wrong. But back to Japan and why they got it right. Yeah, because they have very good economics. And yes, as I was saying earlier, we put it all down to this Japanese miracle. Well, there's massive concentration on what happened after the war years. not much, not much as Vernon points out as he studied there. Not much concentration of what happened in the war, and immediately after the war. Well, this is very key. Sorry, it's a long video, but it's a long explanation. The head of the German war economy is quite a well-known chap, bit of a well-known name to the layman too. He's called Albert Speer. He ran the German war economy. He made sure that prisoners of war would become sort of sort of slaves, work in work camps, and he was after the war sentenced to 30 years plus in Spandau prison. So older guys would know that. What happened to the man in charge of the Japanese war economy? He did a very similar thing with, or worse, in China, in South Korea. South Korea-Japanese relations are awful because of it. In China, the atrocities were horrendous. If you've heard about what happened to the captured British soldiers, not very good. Let's just leave it there. I mean, after the war, the Russians absolutely wanted to put a lot of the Japanese in jail for the rest of their lives. But yes, the man who was in charge of the Japanese war economy became prime minister for a long period of time, for sort of 10 years-ish. And I think I'm correct in saying that his grandson's Shinzo Abe. And if it's not his grandson who's Shinzo Abe, then it was the prime minister afterwards who was also involved in the war economy of Japan. And forgetting sort of the war crimes, the important part is that the war this is the essential bit, the war economy of Japan and how it worked continued straight after the war. Now the Americans were very happy with this because Japanese was a great big buffer to the Russian, Soviet threat, and they of course didn't want to spend loads of money on rebuilding Japan, so they gave a bit of carte blanche to the Japanese elites who'd been running the country, as long as it didn't cause them huge problems. And the Japanese kowtowed a lot, or bowed a lot, and said, "We'll cause you no problems. Let us free. Let us keep running it, and we will absolutely go along with what the Americans, what you want us to do." So there was a lot of agreement with the Japanese and Americans. And so then what happened? Well, we had companies like Yamaha having huge growth straight after the war. And we had the window guidance policy, which they'd operated during the war and copied from the Germans in 1933. Continuing, and this is what led to the huge Japanese growth. And this is why their capitalism is about as different to our capitalism as our capitalism is to about this is the Soviet era communism. It's just an entirely different animal. The window guidance system that they used to grow so quickly is a very powerful policy, and you will understand it best by that explanation of how it was a war economy footing and it continued all the way up to the 80s and this very famous crash, 1989, housing crash. And that's where it can go wrong, and where it is possibly going wrong today in China, where they call it credit guidance, and where it went so dramatically wrong, where the value of the gardens around the Tokyo Palace, the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, which are actually smaller than Central Park, so you have a reference. The gardens around, this is how powerful the tool was and altogether the Japanese economic growth was, the gardens around the palace in the Imperial Palace in Tokyo were worth more than California. All of California. Which today is sort of 1.5 times the value of the British economy, California. So that's how much the Japanese economy grew, how much it was worth, how much that bubble was. That the bubble in 1989 was one of the very biggest bubbles of all time. It was the biggest housing bubble of all time, almost certainly. But the Japanese still recovered from it. So going back to the World War II and Australia afterwards, I've probably gone on way too long this video. Yes, going back to the World War II and Australia afterwards, Yamaha began in the 20s and even earlier as a piano making company. Specifically piano makers and other musical instrument makers. And in the 30s, they introduced this window guidance policy. And then they started making parts for aeroplanes, specifically propellers and fuselage parts for aeroplanes. And then they began making, in World War II, motorbike parts and then motorbikes themselves. Japan needed a lot of motorbikes, and it helped them hugely with the very swift invasion of Vietnam, going all the way down Vietnam, and then going through Laos and then going all the way to Singapore. They had a huge mechanized unit full of motorbikes. And after World War II, Yamaha went back to making pianos, continued to make motorbikes, continue to make motorbikes to this day, very good motorbikes, and then all sorts of other equipment. But how did their economic system help them do this? Because it was the German system that they copied. The German system discontinued slightly after World War II. It changed under Walter Eucken, who was responsible for the post-World War II German economic miracle, which is another story that they called it. Yeah, they called it a German miracle post-World War II. But yes, they had different economics there as well. It's another story, but Japanese copied the Germans. I need to get more. Yeah, so how does it work then, is the question, this window guidance system? Well, it's completely different to ours because the Japanese make sure that they direct the banks to invest in sectors of their economy. So first of all, they make sure the banks invest inside their economy, and they direct the banks to invest a certain percentage in this sector, a certain percentage in sector B, certain percentages in sector C. And by doing so, they prioritise, and they prioritise as they prioritised in the war, the most important sectors for the growth of Japan. Sector A, category A, was heavy goods industries like shipbuilding, like foundries for weapons. Now after the war, foundries for weapons ceased, so Yamaha, instead of making planes, made motorbikes. So Mitsubishi made cars instead of artillery, etc. Category B was sort of home goods, equivalent like televisions, like furniture, etc. Category C got the smallest amount, and continues to get the smallest amount, all the way up to the real wind down of and where window guidance went wrong, and it can go wrong, it did go wrong, and that's luxury goods. So it's kind of the opposite of France or of Britain and Italy. So luxury goods, they made sure to get the least. And this is almost certainly because they saw the luxury goods market getting the smallest amount of exports, because Japan and later China, who copied the model, saw export goods having the smallest amount of potential for exports. And then I said I was going to talk about South Korea. Well, South Korea, very interesting to compare to today, because Japan in that time was already a big power. It was a League of Nations member. It had a big enough economy. While South Korea was a junk state economy. After the war, it was very, very poor, very hard up. And South Korea, even more than Japan, both economies have nearly no resources to speak of for themselves. South Korea, in the Korean peninsula, has all of the fertile land, and North Korea has a huge amount of resources. It's mountains, and it has coal, it has bauxite, it has hematite, it has iron and aluminium ore to the eyeballs. It has nearly all of the ore, the coal, the steel making you can need in North Korea. And South Korea is the opposite. It's very much fertile land. So they had to import it all themselves, just like Japan had done, but they had the perfect economic setup, which was given to them by the Chinese. But they didn't have this huge population, which is always written about, 50 million people. But they had this window guidance policy for the war, which the Japanese had implemented. And so they were able to build these ships straight after the war when Britain stopped, because we were bankrupt after the war. But these guys weren't much richer. Print new money, instruct the banks to build ships with new printed money. Instead of short-termism, where Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead, and we've had 100 years of short-termism. They built ships for the long term by investing in infrastructure. They also invested in telecoms and had companies like Samsung come from that. But Hyundai was initially a big shipbuilder and heavy industries, and it continues to be so to this day. The downside of that, and it's really, comparatively not a downside. They've gone from a extremely poor nation, equivalent to modern day, like Laos or Cambodia or Vietnam, but poorer, to a nation richer per capita than Britain, an OECD member nation. Downside is that they form the cabals as a result, and these are basically the rich families, because all this money going into certain sectors or certain businesses like Hyundai, whatever, these families that led them became uber rich. But these families and these businesses, they were all South Korean businesses and families, whereas in the UK, for the huge car companies that have not gone bankrupt, like Rover, like MG, which is now Chinese, and that list goes on and on and on. Well, the remaining brands, marks, are Range Rover, a Jaguar, a McLaren, and they're all owned by foreign ownership. McLaren's owned by the Bahrain Sovereign Bank, Jaguar and Range Rover by Tata Steel, and there's barely a big company in Britain which has not been sold to foreign ownership. It's the exception to the rule, which is JCB or Dyson. So then we talk back about Britain. Well, yes, with the most deregulated mortgage sector in the world, and that's meant that in 1960 the average price of a house was £2,000. £2,000 adjusted for inflation from 1960 is £115,000 today, and the average house price today is about £350,000, and that's 3 times 115,000. So house prices have trebled in relation to inflation from 1960. 80% of the deposits are held with of everyone's deposits are held with about 5 high street banks: Barclays, Santander, Halifax, NatWest, and another one. Or say there's New Starling and Monzo and Revolut. Add a few more, but in Germany, for instance, there's over 100 of these very small banks, and that's led to a lot of them of smaller companies doing a lot better, and medium-sized companies And that certainly helped Germany to have a lot of smaller businesses go on for longer when they'd be able to get loans from local businesses. In the past in Britain, it was also the case that there were a lot more local banks and businesses. And the thing about growth is that it is all to do with banks, which we don't talk about, which the press don't talk about because they don't understand that. Because, well, firstly, banks create the money. And the big 5 or 6 banks in the UK, they have the deposits of British civilians, persons, small banks, small companies. But their biggest lenders are, not small businesses in the UK. They wouldn't be closing the business branches all across the UK at the fastest rate in history. Barclays loves to lend to the state of Qatar. HSBC's big lenders are in East Asia. Santander, these guys, they lend to very high net worths, they lend to other banks, lend to investment banks. They don't lend to British businesses. They haven't since, long before the war, actually. This is the problem that began before. But it's the opposite in East Asia, where banks are compelled, they're forced to lend to their own economies for medium and long-term growth, but that growth is far more substantial. The businesses which are domestic don't default, they grow. It's not about short-termism. And you look up the largest 20 banks in the world, and something like 15 are Chinese, and the rest are American, I believe. But yeah, looking at the top 10 as well, I think the last time I checked, they were all Chinese. And that's because they have the credit cards, which is adopted from the Japanese model. And it works exactly the same way. The downside is that, like what happened in the 80s in Japan, it's happening to an extent today in China. It's far easier for banks to do what they do in the West and lend to real estate developers and build houses more than they need, and take money off of renters and produce assets and speculative assets growth, and not create any products or services, just property creation, and that creates housing bubbles. So that's what happened in Japan. It was the mother of all housing bubbles. My professor, who knows far more about it than me, is certain that was manufactured. The Japanese huge housing crash in the 80s, from conversations that he's had with senior BOJ officials. And they are certain that it was manufactured in the 80s, which is an amazing proposition, because they wanted to switch to a Western style capitalist society. And that was because because of the probably more unequal system and the larger government that it held. But either way, that's not explicitly stated, and that's a conversation I need to have. But it was definitely the case that in the 80s, all of these Japanese economists had studied in America, and believed in econometrics, believed in neoclassical economics, and that's not what they were studying in the 80s. So the mother of all housing booms in bubbles in Japan was almost certainly manufactured. But coming back to the British economy and why it's done so badly, well, our monetary policy, we've had quantitative easing in 2008-9 after the crisis. We've had less of it than the Europeans, than the EU, and the ECB. But the economy, we still have inflation. Well, we've got inflation at the moment because of the Conservative government's decisions in the coronavirus epidemic to print huge amounts of money. Americans have inflation problems because they printed trillions, absolutely trillions. And the frustration is that they've not learnt from history. Although I've talked all about Japan and China, the greatest country that did best when it came to controlling growth and controlling inflation was Germany in the 1920s and 30s, under Schacht, who was their central banker. And that's why Japan copied Germany and they didn't copy America or Britain. Britain, of course, in the 20s and 30s presided over the world's largest empire still. India in the 30s suffered a famine and Britain was nearly bankrupt. The economics of Britain in the 20s and 30s was very much around stock exchange and finance, and where it is not much different than it is today. John Maynard Keynes talked a lot about how easy it would be to play the stock markets, play the stock exchange. We very much, looked to America, and we had a similar sort of thing of investing in companies, and we suffered greatly from the crash, where famously Norman Montague hopped on a cruise ship. He was the Governor Bank of England, and at the height of the crash had a nervous breakdown, which is what nearly everyone said at the time, and just went on a cruise in the middle of the Great Depression, the greatest crash of all time. And this is really, you look at it and say, oh, this is 1930, 1931. What the hell's the relevance today? Well, this economy has not changed so greatly at all, really. Britain came off of the gold standard 1931, but we're so similar to where we were in 1931. Okay, we have hedge funds, we have derivatives, so we've really just accelerated from that point. And of course, there's no British Empire anymore, but the similarities are so stark, and yeah, since World War II, it's been let's raise taxes, and that's been the only concrete solution. There's lots of think tanks, but government doesn't really change from let's have more taxes, and occasionally roll them back, but really it's more stealth taxes. So let's go back to that point. Norman Montague jumped on a cruise ship at the height of the Depression, and Britain then was a completely different economy. It was an export economy to an extent. Britain was the world's largest producer of coal in the 20s, and it was such an interesting time. And what you learn at school in the books about Germany specifically is so incomplete in terms of economics. Absolutely incomplete. I'll try to wrap up, but it's fascinating how Britain had the largest empire in the world. America has, nearly limitless resources, and Germany has very few resources. But because Britain in the 1860s, 70s has opened itself up to free trade, Germany grows so greatly in the 20s and 30s. And Germany has the largest heavy industries in the 30s, but is barely affected by the Great Depression, and recovers within about a year, and it has nearly zero unemployment by 32, 33. And that's before the Nazis, or just about the time Nazis come to power. We still, on the face of it, have Weimar republics. Full Weimar republics and you have Germany on its knees in 22, 23, but they have enormous growth all the way through the 20s, and that's all to do with Hjalmar Schacht, who's regarded as a economic dictator, and he ran the country like a economic dictator. It's pretty accurate, but his monetary policy was so far ahead of its time. From 1924 to 1948, Germany had two currencies. The Reichsmark was backed by gold, but the Rentenmark, which was a fiat currency, was backed by the land, because they had hyperinflation in 1922. It was terrible. And it's so fascinating reading about his book, Stabilization of the Mark. It's fascinating. And of course, things have changed. Reading Schacht's books, some of the best. His best book is probably the Magic of Money, and he's a very little known economist, central banker. But you could talk about his influence for hours. One could talk about his influence for hours, and should, because Japan copied their economic policies in the 20s and 30s. Nearly everything that Hitler's credited for, huge economic growth and zero unemployment, was all because of this man's great, really genius economics. And it was very, very sad that of what happened then with the worst party in history, the worst policy in history, is coming to power. But one example of just how how interesting the times were was that they had the Treaty of Versailles slowing them down, the Germans, and parts of the Treaty of Versailles stipulated that they must send for free coal to France and England, especially England, as well as steel, so for free. So they sent each year huge amounts of coal to England, huge amounts to France. And on the face of it, great news. But in reality, absolutely debilitating to the British economy and to French. And this is one of the great reasons for the 1926 coal strike, which isn't often referenced, which is the biggest strike in history by coal miners. Because, of course, steel foundries were getting free coal, so they weren't buying British coal. But on the other flip side, Germany is producing all this coal it has to produce for free, and then it's trying to rearm. So then it has to produce double the amount of coal and double the amount of steel, because it's giving away all this coal for free and steel for free. So you don't really, it's not hard to learn in a textbook, but you don't learn about any of that at school. And it's really, really interesting and fascinating as to how and why the Germans grew so fast. And then there's the even more interesting economic policies, which I've sort of glossed over. But I could go for more detail on why Britain's economics don't work so greatly. Where it began is earlier, for certain, but an interesting point in the 20s and 30s, and especially in the 20s and 30s, is of linking an economist's success to his success on the markets. And this was the same with Keynes, and it was definitely in America with Irving Fisher, who's hailed as one of the founders of, or one of the key founders, if not the founder of neoclassical economics, which is the paradigm we practice today. And from the comments of my last video, it was really apparent. And you become famous in economics in two ways. It's by selling really a best-selling book for the masses, such as Hayek's Road to Serfdom, or maybe Noam Chomsky and his How the World Works. These books have great names, and therefore a wide audience. But in the 20s and 30s, and also now, it's how good an economist you are is all to do with how much money you make on the markets. And Irving Fisher bet everything on the markets going up forever. He literally thought in the 20s the markets would never stop. I mean, look it up. But he first made his money, he was not a rich man, by creating this Rolodex. I think the Rolodex is the right word for it. In the 1920s, you'd have a filing system of very small little cards, just like a card you use at school to memorize things. And it was a square box, you'd put the card in and you'd have your contacts on it. He invented a circular equivalent, and all of those cards would be in a circle, and he had a way to twizzle it round, and that made him loads of money. He patented it, and that was used in offices, and it was used as a equivalent of a modern day computer for filing documents, and to know where, like in a library I suppose, all the books were. It was a circular Rolodex, is that the name? But a circular equivalent of before having a proper box. He made his money that way, then put all his money in stock exchange, then lost it all. But in between that, his success on the markets and the success by making that invention is what made him a famous economist in the first place. And today it's not changed. If you're a famous stockbroker, banker, investment banker, then it also equates to being a successful economist. And if you look at the winners of the Sverig's Riksbank's Prize in Nobel in memory of Alfred Nobel, which is the official name of what people call the Nobel Prize in Economics, because Alfred Nobel never wanted there to be, or stated there should be, a prize for Nobel for economics. Nearly all of it's to do with making money out of the markets. None of it's to do, all the winners. The only exception is, the one exception I really think is exceptional is Douglas North. If you really go through the winners of the Nobel Prize, Douglas North and his institutional change and economics performance. But the rest of them, it's all behavioural economics, game theory. It's all about how to make more money from the stock markets, which doesn't grow an economy. Speculative assets do not. And that's what City and stock markets and stock is all about. And I'd love to do an explanation on that, a long form one. I've got to an hour. I'll do a second video on why and how the UK has failed in the long run, because there's so many more things to discuss. For instance, basically how free markets are great for some, not great for others. The classical economists absolutely polite word for it, throwing out the window the ideas of the mercantilists was not really the best idea, as China today and Japan have almost proven. I've reinvented the wheel, but have proven how right mercantile theory was in terms of prioritizing trade, which was Britain's theory for policy for hundreds of years, and how it got to being the world's largest economy before classical economists came along, and how the Chicago School of Economists, beginning with Paul Samuelson's book Economics, he just wrote the book Economics, and that is the standard textbook, and he just absolutely lawnmowered so many standard believed economic principles, just like the classical economists lawnmowed over the ideas of the mercantilists before. So there's a theory I've read that every 80 years there's a real sea change in economic theory, but it's really after every major Great War. After the Napoleonic Wars, you had the introduction of classical economists who were very keen to say the mercantilists were wrong. And after World War II, you had the Chicago economists with the Cambridge economists to a point really, really gunning to say this is neoclassical economics, all about theory, it's all about science, and classical economics is wrong. So there's far more to say about that, and the modern mantra that Adam Smith's the father of economics is fantastic. If you don't read anyone that's any of the economists before, and you're American instead of British, and you don't realise how much the mercantile economists and merchants and traders made in the Elizabethan times, and the Dutch traders made and the Portuguese traders, it doesn't really add up. So yeah, there's far more to discuss. It's not a short story, it's not a short topic, and it's an incredibly important one. It's the most important topic, it's the most important subject, economics in practice. If the economics in practice, the real economics, not behavioural or game economics or game theory, is a keystone over an archway, and all of the other topics, departments, every other subject leans off of economics. You can't have medicine, you can't have law, you can't have politics, you can't have accounting, you can't have engineering without successful economics, because you can't have them all without a successful economy. And that's why it's so important to understand all these, and that's why it's so important to have high growth and low inflation, and that's why monetary policy is so important, because that's the most important of all. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll make a follow-up video in the future.